Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, founder and CEO at Family Office Association and host of the Angelo Robles podcast. We really look forward to today. It's been a guest that I've been looking to get on now for a couple of weeks, which is a long time for me. Normally, like 1 or 2 days later, boom, we move. I'm going to call it Banking Insights, Iceland's Secret, the Untold Story of the World's Biggest Con. Pretty easy how I got most of that title, because the special guest we have on today, Jared Bibler, is the author of an upcoming book coming out next Tuesday, which I believe is October 4th of that name. Now, I'm really looking forward. Jared has an amazing background that I want to get into. And what happened in Iceland, and I think it's a lesson to be learned, and probably one to some degree that we're kind of repeating now, is one that is worthy of discussion, but much, much more broad than that title. Today's going to be a long form interview. We're going to cover really banking around the world, the rise of central bank digital currencies and that impact, Switzerland specifically in banking, China, the US, the encroachment, I think, one day of US fintech and tech companies into banking and finance, and how all that could intertwine. We'll even get into a couple of Angelo's crazy conspiracy theory questions. How about that, to make you all excited? So on that note, to give a little bit deeper context, Jared, our special guest today, was born in the US in Massachusetts. He relocated to Iceland in 2004, only to find himself in the middle of an unprecedented financial crisis a handful of years later. What a good way to be thrown into the fire. He's a graduate of MIT, where he studied engineering, and it's really a pleasure to have him on. Jared, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Angelo. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the nice intro.
Thank you.
What can I tell you?
Oh,
How should we begin?
So, born in the U.S., at least I'm making that assumption
That's right.
from Massachusetts, unless something changed. You went to MIT and you studied engineering. What would inevitably lead you into, let's call it, banking or consulting?
I started engineering. I thought that's what I wanted to do. I think that's what my father wanted me to do. So I studied mechanical engineering, but I was always interested in the markets. When I was in third grade, I used to get the Boston Globe and read the stock quotes. They would come out every Sunday. You could see all the quotes for the week. Do you remember when they did that? You could read, like, you could look at any company.
Unfortunately, yes, I am old enough by far.
So I used to do that, and pretty soon after MIT, I was working at a manufacturing company outside Boston. I didn't like it very much, and I decided I jumped into the .com boom, actually, in San Francisco. I worked for a company which shall remain nameless, but which was really, this was kind of my intro to financial fraud. This is a company that was really inflating everything. Do you know the term vaporware?
Yes.
We were writing vaporware. So we did have a product. It did work a tiny bit, but they were going out and closing $5 or $10 million deals with insurance companies. Even Enron was a client of theirs. And they were promising mission critical software. And we just didn't have anything that worked to the level that these poor clients liked. And anyway, this company ended up going public right after I left, and doing quite well for a couple of months on the market, and then it crashed with the .com crash, or slightly before that. That was kind of my intro to the software world and the finance world. We were delivering trading applications and asset management applications and other things like that, insurance applications as well.
Very intriguing. And we'll get to what made you get up and go to Iceland, of all places. And boy, you picked a really great time soon after to be there. But let's stay a little bit with, I'm always intrigued, MIT. It's a great school. But you kind of felt that butt coming up, given that you took engineering, a little bit of quote unquote pressure from your father. It wasn't something you probably had a passion for. If you look back, what was the most valuable lesson you learned at MIT?
I think so. I did both a bachelor's and master's there, and I had a master's thesis advisor who looked like a nice guy, but he was anything but. And he would he had a beard, like he was probably my age now. He would have a beard like this, and if I said anything a little bit imprecise, he would say, Jared, no, why would you say that? And so he really pushed, and elsewhere at MIT as well, I really learned the importance of data and precision. And that kind of helped me in all kinds of ways later in my career, to go to the videotape, to get the data, to tell the story from the data, and to be precise about your conclusions. I think that was probably the biggest lesson for me, how to think clearly and present clearly.
Interesting. So that does probably segue a little bit into, I had a MIT graduate, founder of a public company called MicroStrategy. His name is Michael Saylor. Those active in Bitcoin and crypto, he may be the leading voice behind Bitcoin. He's very articulate and very passionate. Right or wrong, your call. We'll get to some of that stuff a little bit later. But he said, even on his first day, he felt the energy of really how to think for yourself. And I always found, although it's been about 6-7 months now, that really stuck with me. You had a bit of a different perspective, but at the end of the day, it did kind of come back a little bit to thinking for yourself. And how valuable do you think that is?
I think it's very valuable. Actually, I would add to that humility, because to get into MIT, you have to be like first in your class or something, and you think you're great. I came in first in my class in a normal working class Massachusetts high school, and I thought I was, the cat's pajamas or whatever you want to say. And on the first day, they had everybody stand up. They had us all out in Killian Court, which is the main court at the front of the school, all the freshmen, and they had us all stand up. They said, if you're first in your class, stand up. If you're second in your class, stand up. And after they said first and second, almost everybody was standing up. And then you'd go into these classes, and there was always someone better. There was always someone better. You were never the best. And this is good. This is a good lesson, I'd be in classes where I was really I had almost no idea what was going on. I was just struggling to breathe in the class, basically. And there would be somebody in there who would be half asleep, and correcting the professor. So it was a very humbling place to go.
Wow, correcting the professor. Actually, that segues a bit into my next question relative to MIT and generally high-level schools. Do great schools like that, and MIT, I'm not denying it's not a great school, and there's others, but do those top tier, those top 1% colleges, do they really create winners, or do they choose them? Like you said, you were number one in your class. You probably had super high SATs. I'm not denying the network of relationships you develop, but in terms of the money that you or your parents were paying for directly for the education, and in today's world, we have YouTube. You could watch videos. I think that Saylor said his professor from the 80s has a YouTube channel where it might even be better than being live in the class. And I guess Saylor's saying that he's so smart that he basically plays it at double the speed. So he gets the information in half the amount of time that he would have, looking back in the past. So how do you think that all interplays?
I think that's an excellent point that you make about selecting winners. I have mixed feelings. I can't speak for other of those type of schools, but at MIT it was a pretty brutal experience quite often. We dreaded, and this was I don't know how it is today. This is in the 90s, but we dreaded the start of the semester. We dreaded this. People talked openly about. Nobody was looking forward to going back. We were looking forward to seeing our friends. But the pressure was intense, and I'm not sure what we got for that, because, yes, if I had continued as a mechanical engineer, I probably would have been a pretty good one with that training. But I'm not sure that was necessary. I think I would have rather had more time to explore other things, other interests. So I don't. Getting back to your question, I don't know. I think, unfortunately, a lot of those elite American schools, it's about the brand.
Oh,
Um,
for sure. And
yeah,
that's an
and
industry, I guess, in ed tech that is probably ripe for disruption, but it's very entrenched.
yeah,
I mean, I have pretty strong opinions about it. I think a lot of what's occurring now is happening so rapidly that by the
hmm
time they keep pace with the curriculum and the professors, maybe being a little bit more up to date on certain things going on, it's now old news. But let's
yes.
not keep on pounding some of our great schools. It's just that
Sure.
I think it's okay to
Move
question.
us on, Angelo. Yeah, no, it's definitely okay to question.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and that's kind of what
Yeah.
I wanted to do. Before we get started with my next series of questions, we did get a response in from a live participant, and I'm going to agree with them. If it's possible, uh, it's coming through a little lightly in terms of your sound.
Okay.
And I know it's always hard to talk
Is
louder and keep that consistent. So I don't know if
is this better now?
that
If
is
I do it
better.
this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
Okay.
probably it's the mic being closer to you.
Yeah, and I just turned up the gain a little bit.
Oh, great.
This
That worked
this
perfectly.
yeah, okay.
That engineering background, I'm telling you,
This
MIT
Angelo,
did come through after all.
this is from this is from recording the audiobook. I became an expert on
Okay, so we now have a little bit of your background. We know what you did to some degree after you left school. The bigger picture is what inspired you to write the book, which we'll go into. Why
Sure.
did you go to Iceland? I'm assuming for a job, but you probably wanted the adventure, the
Yes.
difference, and
Yeah.
kind of in a
Yeah.
different community. So tell us all about that.
Well, I worked after the startup experience in San Francisco, which was a only about a year that I was there. I worked for a major Wall Street bank for almost 5 years, or a little more than 5 years, and I was rolling out. So it was hardcore programming and business analysis. We were rolling out their global back office in Tokyo, London, and New York. So they had a new and pretty awesome real-time back office that we implemented. I was part of a small team in Boston that was doing this work for them, and that just burned me out because we were working often, 12-hour days all week, and then all weekend you'd have to be back in the office at 5 a.m. on Saturday to turn on the to do the conversion to turn on the system for the next week. And so I had vacationed in Iceland and I stumbled into an opportunity there doing back office work for Icelandic banks. And it was a huge pay cut and it was a huge hours cut. It was like, I was working maybe 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, maybe in Iceland. And I just decided I'll try this for a year and see what it's like. And I had always dreamed to live somewhere else and try to work in a different language and try to just really, it was kind of a new challenge I wanted can I integrate myself in a new society, learn a new language, and be productive in that new place? And so that was really the driver, was to have the adventure and to have the challenge.
So the world suffered a financial crisis, obviously, in 2008 that we all know about, but it's not as widely known that Iceland's economy was leveled, truly.
Right.
You
Yes.
tell the story, of course, in your book, Iceland's Secret. The perpetrators in Iceland were the country's, effectively, what was the three largest banks.
Yes.
What were those banks? What were they doing that sowed the seeds for the collapse, really, of Iceland's economy?
I think, so the reason I wrote the book is I think, at least in the English-speaking world, that story gets a little bit of coverage. I mean, some people know that Iceland jailed its bankers,
Mhm.
but that's really kind of a tiny piece of the story. These banks were very sleepy. Iceland has a population of at the time 270,000. Now it's about 360, I think. It's growing fast, but it was a very small country, and it had a small bank for the farmers, and another bank which really served the fishing interests, and another bank for everybody else. And these were just very small, sleepy, mostly government-owned banks. And they were privatized between 1998 2003. But they were privatized in a very, I guess you could say, crony capitalistic way. There were two parties in power in the country. They were the same two parties were also voted in last Saturday in the latest elections. These two parties are almost always in power. It's the Independence Party and the Progressive Party, and they each took a bank and gave it out to to members of the party. So two of the banks were privatized that way. And then the banks were in that time. That was when Greenspan had interest rates super low. It was right after the dot-com crisis in the U.S., and so interest rates were kind of low for a few years. And Iceland had been paying really high interest. Iceland had historically high inflation, so for an Icelandic bond, you could get 8 or 10% in local currency terms. Yeah, and so that started this carry trade, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with. You borrow Swiss francs or dollars or yen, and you buy a higher yielding currency. You buy the bonds of the higher yielding currency, and you just print free money until the currencies, adjust, which always happens in the end. And so that's what happened in Iceland. There was money just flooding in. Those banks were able to grow very fast. And
where was that? I mean, obviously Iceland's very small, so it wasn't, probably a small percentage relatively local. Weren't people in the UK and Netherlands and other countries like heavily marketed to when capital was coming from abroad?
That's a little ahead of the story. That came later. First, they were able to just borrow from Deutsche Bank and the wholesale capital markets. They were able to borrow as much as they needed to grow in the early couple of years, up to 2006. And then in 2006, people started taking a look, foreign analysts, and realized, they asked the question. It's the same question that Bethany McLean asked about Enron in 2001. How does Enron make money? And then nobody could answer. She wrote that in an article. Nobody could answer the question in the article. And within, I think, 6 months, Enron had collapsed. I bring up Enron because each of those banks was about the size of an Enron when they collapsed. They were huge.
Wow, I didn't know that.
They were 10 times bigger than the country's economy. I mean, they were just, it was a catastrophe. So in 2006, foreign analysts started to really look at them and their cross shareholdings and their loan books. And they said, who are these loans being made to, and so on. And that was the end of their access to the European debt markets. That was kind of like, and that's when the real risks began, because they had been operating a kind of Ponzi growth model where you make a bunch of bad loans, and then within a year or year and a half, you borrow more and you double your balance sheet, and you hope that the loans you make that year are better, and then they're not, and you keep growing like this to outgrow your mistakes. And that worked for 3, 4, 5 years. The biggest bank bragged about doubling its balance sheet every year for 3 years, I think. And so in 2006, they were then able to open savings accounts in the UK and the Netherlands, as you bring up, and other countries in Europe. And then they were able to take retail money to keep the growth going. And then the biggest bank went to Mexico, Japan, Wall Street, and Hong Kong in 2006 or 7 to keep growing. And then they all collapsed. We're coming right up on the 13th anniversary. They all collapsed the 6th, 7th, and 9th of October 2008. So within 4 days, they were all collapsed. So it was like 3 Enron collapses in 3 days, really.
I was going to use the verbiage. You had harsher words, and you hinted at it. I'd like to hear more. That did the Iceland banks become somewhat of a hedge fund in terms of how they were investing? But you used the word Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, I kind of think it was more like that. I mean, because the loans that they were making in the early year. Well, let's get into what they were doing with their loans. If you want me to give away the.
Sure. Why not? Get right to it.
Yes. So here's the amazing thing about the whole story, which I think people really need to appreciate. These were the largest cases of stock market manipulation in history. These 3 banks. History not of Iceland, but anywhere. Because, as we said, they were Enron sized. So they're huge balance sheets. And they had a lot of capital. They had a lot of liquidity, a lot of money. And so starting in the early years, they were already in trouble. Their stocks on both the Icelandic and Swedish stock markets started to drop in value. There wasn't much appetite for their equity. Fine. Maybe that, and so then if the market had been allowed to work, maybe there would have been a correction. Maybe they would have stopped their growth and so on. But they didn't do that. They started to buy up their own shares whenever the share price dropped. So they would take bank money, the prop desk traders would buy and keep the price from going down. When I started investigating after the crash, I traced that behavior back to 2004. So the whole time of the boom, basically. And it got worse and worse. So it got to the point where in 2007 and 8, there were many days where they bought 75% of the market volume of themselves, or even 100%. So imagine an Enron that completely controls its share price on the market, and nobody stops it. It takes the cash it has in the bank, buys up its own shares every day. This is a lot different than an announced share buyback, because it was never announced. I mean, nobody knew this was happening in the public. Certainly not the people on Wall Street or the U.S. pension or the Canadian pension funds who bought their bonds certainly didn't know that their equity was completely a fiction. And these three banks were so big relative to Iceland's economy that they were the stock market.
Exactly.
So when they went down, the market lost 97% of its value.
97%.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the impact on Iceland's economy from this? Is it still being felt?
Yes, I think. I just read an opinion piece this morning in Iceland that the crisis had, because we just had elections on Saturday, so people are taking stock now of how things are. And this columnist said, we're still in the crisis from 2008. It's the crisis of 2008 to 2021.
Importantly, how did this affect the average citizen in Iceland? Well, obviously, they're still being impacted.
I could speak for myself. We lost our house. We lost our, we didn't lose our car because we had an old car and it was paid off. But a lot of people lost their car. We lost the value of a lot of our pensions was gone, and even our cash savings was mostly wiped out. So it was just a reset to zero. And even as you'll see in the book, even in the first weeks, there was no food on the shelves. I mean, I can't imagine a worse financial panic to live through. You'd wake up with a nauseous feeling every morning because it was like, we don't know if we will be able to make our mortgage this month. We don't know if we'll be able to buy food and so on. It was absolutely devastating.
Right. And that could lead to uprising, civil unrest, and to some degree, understandably so. Very, very challenging. And I promise I'm going to bring, a lot of this back to what's happening now.
Yeah.
Banking, central banking, the impact of potentially central bank digital currencies. And it just takes a while to build up into that whole story, because I think this does go back to what you're talking about now is so intriguing. Perhaps on that note, due to the huge size of the Icelandic financial system in comparison with the Icelandic economy, the Central Bank of Iceland found itself, I guess, unable to act as a lender of last resort during the crisis.
That's right, yeah.
Due to the current monetary policy, are we setting up for the biggest global crash in the history of financial markets?
I think so. And that's another reason I wrote the book. I think what you'll see in the book, so this is not really a story about Iceland. Sure, Iceland's great. It's a cute country. Everybody loves Iceland. But this is a story about wherever you're sitting right now, because you will see in the book, Iceland is a nice test case. It's a nice way to view the forces at work in bigger countries, because we have everything there that you have in a bigger country, but it's a little easier to see. So there's a character in the book who's a real person who I took him a pretty big regulatory breach while I was working at the regulator. I found something really interesting that his team should look into. And he just stood there and flipped through the legal codes like this for 10, 20 minutes until he found somewhere where it said, I don't have to do anything about this problem. And that to me is, I've worked in other countries and I've seen this type of archetype in other regulators as well. And look, I don't blame those people either. I don't want to bash them, but regulators anywhere, they don't have an incentive to take action hardly ever. They may take action on small things. Like if you look at the US SEC's press releases, they do take a lot of action, but these are like $20,000 or $50,000 or $100,000 insider trading schemes or something, some small thing. So they get a press release. But in terms of looking at systemic problems that could cause the supermarket shelves to go bare, nobody's really looking at that, I don't think.
I think an important follow-up question, can this happen if a country can print and borrow, like the US and others, in its own currency?
It makes it's nice to be the US, right? Because you print the world's reserve currency.
For now.
For now.
We'll get to that.
I think that's a very good question. I think in the case of Iceland, it would be better. It would have been much better if the banks had borrowed in Icelandic krona, but they did not. They borrowed in euros. They borrowed in euros and dollars. And that meant that the central bank could not print euros and dollars and really just got left in the lurch. I mean, the central bank only had, I think, less than $2 billion in hard currency. And the bank's balance sheets were $182 billion at collapse. So, but to answer your question, yeah, I think it's much easier if you can print and borrow in your own currency. That makes it less likely. But I think that just postpones the problem, actually.
I agree with that. It does postpone it. Somewhat relative to my question before, but maybe a little bit more succinct. What parallels in today's world mirror the Iceland crisis?
I think you have a hugely indebted, so world debt to GDP is almost, I think the record was set, 6 months ago? Now it's come back a little bit, but it's still, I think, 350% or something like this. It's never been so high. And I think, especially in some countries like Switzerland, we have an oversized financial sector relative to the economy. So we have a risk of a mini Iceland. Credit Suisse is in the news every day now for Archegos, for Greensill, and these are things that you and I have never heard of until they come out, right? If one of the Swiss banks, for example, goes down, I think we could see a mini Iceland here. I hope not, because I live here, but that's a worry for me. In general, I think when you read the book, by the time you get to the end, most people, I mean, it's an enjoyable read. It's it's all good stories from these investigations that we did. But I think you'll get to the end and feel pretty unsettled, because you could see that there are probably, how do I say this? There are unseen problems in the world's financial system that are maybe too big to bail out, or too big to fix at this point. And we don't really know what they are, but they're probably lurking there. Because, as I said, the incentive to clean up anything like that before the fact just doesn't exist. Nobody's getting paid to cut down a bank's derivative book, or to right, like nobody's getting paid to stop. No big deal that a bank wants to do ever gets stopped by a compliance department. It just doesn't happen. the CEOs, if the top guys want to do a big deal, they'll do it, and then the compliance can window dress it after. But there isn't really, there's no teeth in my experience.
I agree 100%. Completely agree with that. You mentioned, I probably wasn't going to bring it up, but you brought it up. Now I'm going to have to jump into it.
All right.
Archegos. I always mess up the name.
Yeah,
Mr.
I mess it up too. Right.
Now, I could say several things about it. The guy made his money as a hedge fund manager under the Tiger 21 brand. He personally made what, after, I don't know, 15 or so years, about 200 million, and kudos to him. Mm-hmm. To take that and to potentially within 7 or 8 years, 30 exit, meaning 30 times the amount that he had that he put in, is actually kind of amazing in terms of, as a trader, that's like an all-time, like, wow. It's easier to do that with modest amounts of money. But to take hundreds of millions and then into the billions, keep on multiplying it, that's like, I'll tip my hat, at least to some degree, to that capability. But let's bring the banks into this. They're crying everything now. Oh, like we didn't really know.
Yeah.
This man paid over $500 million in fees over the course of that 7 or 8 years, from what we know so far, relative to the banks on these swaps. So for them to pull the rug on them and all this, I don't know. I found that a little suspicious, and it left me chuckling and also scratching my head.
Yeah.
Any insights relative to like these financial weapons of mass destruction?
Well, there's a nice story in the book about Deutsche Bank and the biggest Icelandic bank. Deutsche has since paid back most of the money that it took on that deal. I think they settled that in a court settlement or out of court a few years ago. But they took around 500 million euros from the biggest Icelandic bank in order to manipulate their CDS spread down for them. That's a pretty amazing story in and of itself.
For sure. Now, you were hired by Iceland's supervisory authority to help with the investigation.
Yep.
How did that come about?
Well, so I had quit October 3rd. I worked in one of these banks. I moved over from the software and I worked in asset management for 2 years. I was a fund manager. And the book goes into a lot of the kind of hijinks that I saw. And I couldn't sleep for the last 4 or 6 months in that job because of the things that we were doing with clients' money at work. I really didn't like it. So I quit, and my last day was October 3rd. And as I said, the banks collapsed the next week in 3 days. And so and the country was, we had no food on the shelves and that sort of thing. The country was in dire straits, and I thought at the time that I quit, it would have been easy for me to walk across the street and join a pension fund on their investment team. It would have been no problem. So I thought it would be no problem. And then, of course, the collapse came, and then I had nothing for 6 months. It was quite a scary time, to be quite a dark winter in Iceland. And so the regulator, I had applied to them, and they called me out of the blue, and they said, we need someone to investigate these collapsed banks. Would you like to come in and interview for that? And I said, sure. So I did, and they chose me and one other guy. They had 190 or 200 applicants for this job.
Wow.
They chose two, because the unemployment was crazy. It was just, it was just so many people looking for work in those days in Iceland. And so they took us in off the street, and they just gave me like an empty desk with a computer and a phone, and they said, "Okay, go investigate." And that was one of the scariest moments so far in my professional career, because I had no idea. I mean, here we had 3 Enrons, and I was supposed to look into them. I didn't really know where to start. It was a humbling experience to start there with kind of nothing.
CEOs went to jail. There were 3 big banks. How many of them? Just one of them? All 3?
all three went to prison. Although I think they were all sentenced to prison, but I just learned that the CEO of Landsbank, he never showed up to prison to serve his sentence. And then later he was found, I think later they reduced the sentence in an appeal so he didn't have to go.
Kind of exonerated or time served for avoiding the authorities.
Yeah.
Cronyism again.
They all went for various cases related to this big market abuse that I mentioned.
Do you think that the investigation even went far enough?
No.
In what way?
Well, as you'll see in the book, we were shut down pretty early. So I did the first few big cases with just a real skeleton crew. And then I kept appealing, look, I need a team to investigate these things. I finally got a team of about 5 people working with me, and my colleague had 5 or 6 people. So we finally had investigation teams running in 2010, 11. But by the end of 2011, the word on the street inside the regulator was it was time to shut this down. And we had, I think, done maybe 10% of the total cases. So we had a lot of insider trading cases that we never cracked. We had to sort cases by size and recency. So any inside trader with like less than $1 million in profits was off the hook, because we didn't have any staff, and then it was just shut down. And this is another thing that gives me a lot of pause about the state of global financial markets, because there aren't that many competent investigators out there. There are some, but they don't have a mandate. And anyone who sticks his head a little too high up is not really welcome in that world.
It gets cut off. Yeah. And I think we're going to get to some of the reasons behind that very, very soon. So everyone just stay tuned. I need to take a step back, but this is greed, and greed all the way around, even going back to, again, offering high interest rates to people both in country and out of country that were probably out of line with what kind of made sense, but people wanted more than 1 or 2%, more than 3 or 4%.
Yeah.
They were getting much more than that. And the reality is, there's a saying, reach for yield, reach for risk. Eventually it bit them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think in the UK, they were offering even 7% in British pounds. Yeah.
And I understand. I mean, those that may not be as educated in financial markets and looking into banks, or you feel that the government is regulating the banks so you don't have to do diligence, which would be wrong, but they may not have the background to understand that a 7% yield is going to look attractive. When in reality, when you look at it was, like you said, I was generous calling it a probably not well managed hedge fund. Really, certainly much more of a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, one of my very random questions. Is China the world's incubator? There's various ways you could go with that, but for now, and expound any way you want, but I would potentially look at central bank digital currencies.
Yeah, I'm pretty fascinated with that idea, the central bank digital currencies, since I learned about them. I'm not an expert on them. I learned about them maybe 2017. There were some talks here in Zurich about that. And don't you think this is I think this is such an attractive tool that central banks will have a hard time saying no to rolling this out. I think. That was my feeling from the beginning. It gives them the chance to literally steal money out of your wallet, right? If they put a negative interest rate on the cash that's in your digital wallet to encourage you to spend it faster, for example, that is a policy tool that they have not had to now, because Switzerland pioneered this. I think Switzerland pioneered this a few years ago, the negative interest rate on certain balances. But the way to get around that is just to take out Swiss francs in cash, and then you have zero, and you just hold the cash. But if you have a central bank digital currency, you can put the interest rate negative on that as well. I think that's a powerful tool for them.
Oh, it's much more than that, but that's a big part of it. We're going to get to that. But the first part of the question,
yeah,
and I know it's broad and you could go with it any way you want, is China the world's incubator?
You mean the sense that they're, yeah, I don't know how to answer that. You mean the sense that they're going to be the one to roll out these type of innovations first, or to try these
They
things?
appear to have an edge in certain things, AI, quantum, perhaps,
Yep.
definitely in fintech, financial
Yep.
technologies, and central bank digital currencies are going to be overall a part of that. But
Yep.
look at some of their largest tech companies in the world of fintech. They also have helped the unbanked that traditional banks have ignored.
Yep.
And there's just so many different variances of how fintech and technology could meld, I guess you could say, with the world of banking and finance and even the government. This gets intriguing and appear to have an edge, right or wrong, in terms of their experimentations.
Yeah, I saw this article. They were giving out, and I don't know what happened with this. This was over the summer. They were giving out central bank digital currency as a pilot, right? By lottery in Beijing. I'd be really interested to see how that rolls out. I think isn't one of the Nordic central banks also looking at this now, at piloting this? I think I saw this as well.
Oh, this is a trend that is, we're not going to go from analog to digital and let's forget it and go back to analog. I think that cat's out of the bag. A lot of this was spurred by Bitcoin, some of it by COVID, China taking the lead. I think the US acting very slowly in it.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, you could make a point, maybe that's the wise decision. But to think, well, I don't want to jump the gun, because I think before we really dive into central bank digital currencies, I think we do have to understand a comment that you said, if I heard you correctly, and I've been saying for years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's more powerful entities on earth, whether banks or big governments, than effectively central banks. Central banks are like, they're the power.
They're where it's at. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I know I sound a little bit like a conspiracy theorist and people, and, I get it from all sides, more on the left, on the right, in the middle, like but to not realize that. And if you want to cover central banks broadly, talk about how many of them are owned and controlled by the government, and then who's behind that at the government. But some of them are private or partially private.
Yeah,
Look here, like actually Switzerland, I think, is a combination. And Swiss, the US, the Fed it's banks, it's privately held enterprises that is overseen by the government. I get it. But why don't I just let you run with central banks and how powerful they are?
I think, well, yes. So I wanted to say, I own a couple of shares in the Swiss National Bank. But it's a little bit of a crazy structure, because they're called equity and they trade on the Swiss equity market, but they only ever pay a fixed dividend, and a very low one. And all the profits of the central bank flow to the Swiss cantons. So they're the real equity holders. This is more like a convertible bond, or, it's kind of but I can say I'm an owner of it. I think that was a structure that was more in fashion, 50 years ago, to have central banks that traded on the market. But to your broader point, yes, I think especially now, as we see a lot of questions around the strength of democracy in various countries, I think the real power, the real change makers are the central bankers. They don't like this, at least in Switzerland. They don't like this characterization. They just say, "Oh, we're just bureaucrats. We follow checklists." That's kind of how they probably would portray themselves. But they have the printing press. They can buy equities now. Their activities since 2008 and especially since COVID have expanded massively.
Mhm.
And I think they're the one. If we want to change something, for example, if we want to fix climate change, I think it's the central banks that would have to do that. I don't see a more powerful entity, and I don't think this
I
conspiratorial.
don't.
They just have the levers.
Yes. And you're in a unique situation in Switzerland, like the banking capital of the world and home of the Bank of International Settlements. We'll get to that in some of my Angelo stuff a little bit later. But staying on that theme, so I mean, what you just said, I mean, I guess in the US, if you own as a shareholder, if it's a public company, shares in one of the banks that make up the Fed, that's a little bit similar to what you just said in Switzerland. It's just packaged up a little differently and kept a little more. I mean, it's open if you want to research it, but it's a little more hush hush.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, you look at that in terms of, okay, so it's privately held by what, 12 banks? Let's say they're public banks. Who's the largest shareholders of the bank? Who's influential? And these are all people that may have an influence. And some of them are not even US citizens relative to, let's call it central bank policy, directly or indirectly here in the US. Okay, this does bring up one of my next questions. They'll
Yes.
probably get a chuckle that I want you to answer it as
Sure.
seriously as your research has
Yeah.
proven.
Yeah.
Is the world, aka governments and central banks, is the world secretly controlled by a small number of families?
I don't think so, but I don't think I haven't seen any evidence of that, but it could be true. However, does it matter? Because these large institutions will act the way they act because all the incentives are in that direction. So you don't have to believe in a cabal of families. You just have to believe in the purest form of capitalism to see that these institutions would function in line in this way regardless. Does that make sense?
I hear you. Do you think we're potentially moving towards, and this is going to sound like a world government and whatever the entities that we would be familiar with that may even take over lesser countries if we have a collapse? I could paint an unusual picture. I guess what I'm getting to is, are we moving towards a one world rule, a new world order? And do you think that could happen as soon as 20 or 30 years?
I don't think so.
I hope not.
I hope not. I guess that's more I hope not. Yeah. Yeah.
A little bit along those lines. So we go back to banking. I mean, I could argue banking goes back really to China many thousands of years ago, but banking and double entry, as we know it, what was it? I could be a little off, the 1400s, the Medici family in Italy. And you look at that, and actually, in some ways, not much has really evolved in that. Bitcoin came along with a decentralization, and we'll get to some of that shortly. But my bigger picture question, relative to some of the questions that I just asked, is you look at the heritage of influential banking families, primarily in Europe, going back hundreds of years ago, more so than people think, I would say, in Italy. And is there any tie into that when you do the research that you've done, or maybe I'll spur you to do some more moving forward, with the influence of those families, including in the Catholic Church, aka the Vatican?
I know people in some of those families here.
Well, of course, they all have residences and businesses
Yeah.
in Switzerland, which we'll also get to.
Yeah. So in terms of the Vatican, I was just there actually a funny story for you, Angelo. I went to the Vatican. I went down there to Rome, and I stayed near the Vatican, and I just stayed in a hotel next to the Vatican. I just booked it online, and I knew that I had to fill out a COVID entry form for Italy, and I thought I would get it on the train, but I didn't. And I looked on my phone, and it's, you get this at the hotel. So I went into my hotel, I checked in, gave my passport and everything. And I said, can I get one of these COVID reporting forms from you? And she said, "You're not in Italy, pal." Because this hotel was an extraterritorial possession of the Vatican. It was across the street from the Vatican, but it was Vatican ground. So I didn't have to follow the rules of the Italian. So I mean, I'm fascinated by the Vatican. I think when you walk around there, you can see how much wealth has been plundered from around the world over the centuries, and I think you can. I think the Vatican has been a powerful kind of what's the word? Disproportionately powerful in the world, in the last hundreds of years. I can't speak to any on the financial side power that the Vatican has. I haven't seen anything like that, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, it's a hugely financially powerful and influential state within a state, and the fact that it exists at all is kind of strange, right? The fact that it's a country with its own flag and passports and everything, and it's kind of just a city. Yeah, it's a fascinating place. I like to go there. But it wouldn't surprise me, I guess.
We're going to get to Switzerland shortly, and I'm just thinking out loud. That would be one place that would interest me from this broader macro type discussion that we're having. I mentioned China, definitely Switzerland. There might be another, more specific than just the UK. I look at the city of London, and specifically, literally, the city of London. And it's not quite the Vatican inside of Italy, but there's a little bit of some similarities here and there. Right. Would you like to discuss that and what some of your research may have uncovered, or maybe that's upcoming in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I don't have anything for you on that one. That's an interesting analogy that you have, though, between the Vatican and the city of London.
Yeah, like I can imagine my audience listening to me saying, "Angelo, what are you talking about? London is a city inside the UK." Yeah, but I'm specifically talking about, again, look it up. Some of the research is out there, specifically the city of London. It's a subset of London. It's not quite the way the Vatican is to Italy, because it does fall under UK rule, but there's certain protocol and uniqueness, and I would argue a little bit of mystique and secrecy relative to banking and how powerful the UK actually is from specifically, AKA the city of London, from a banking perspective. Yeah, we're bringing up a lot of stuff today. Probably the audience is like, this guy's crazy. Not you. They think you're normal. It's me. And other thing, and I'll see if I could phrase this into a question. When you look at, I could argue the central banks and big companies aligned, BlackRock, et cetera, I find it interesting. They're purchasing a lot of homes. They get great interest rates. I guess you could use that phrase. And I'm trying to think of what my question is, but if things go to hell in a handbasket and collapse, could you see governments in those institutions almost using that as places where people live to gain control of the populace, to help in the event of chaos and civil unrest? I phrased that terribly. Pardon me. I should have gave it more thought. But you may get the general gist of it if that is something you've uncovered in your research.
Let me see if I can understand. So you're saying, wait, the fact that BlackRock is buying up residential houses?
Upper middle class homes, great deals and bargains, I guess you could say, mainly because they could get access to capital so favorably.
Yes.
And I don't know, just in thinking, I tend to be very, I'm definitely not big government. I guess you could say I'm a libertarian, and we probably disagree on certain philosophies, and that's good. I want to have different opinions, but I'm just always very careful of government or entities around the government, and what their end game is, which we'll really jump into with central bank digital currencies very shortly. But I'm looking at the full picture. I think there's devious activities and lots of thought that have gone into governments and central banks and kind of what could go wrong and how we could have further control of the population.
But isn't that just BlackRock? I mean, isn't that kind of the sort of Thomas Piketty flow of capital upward?
Yes.
This BlackRock phenomenon. I mean, eventually you have only serfs and then you have a few people that own all the houses. I mean, that's how it seems to me.
Yes, that would be a little different way of putting it. But yes, you would be correct. I mean, I could paint a picture in some of the futuristic work I've done so some of the work that I do is consulting the families, often truly significant families. Maybe they're the ones that control the world that I mentioned before, on sovereign risk. And there was a train of thought by the super rich here in the US. Angelo, you're kidding me. It's the US. There's nothing to worry about. And then COVID came along. Civil unrest in the US. Some will argue the ending of Trump's presidency, and some will argue the current president in some directions that they're headed. And now those families are like, you're crazy, but I can now see how there's a chance what you're saying is right. And it's keeping me from sleeping properly at night. What could I do to mitigate or hedge the risk of even a country like the US really getting flipped really badly? I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And it's probably not going to happen, but what could I do to mitigate my risk if it does? And these are all, and I'm not going to give away all my secrets.
Do you tell them to buy? Do you tell them to buy gold, Angelo?
That gold and art play a little bit into it. More importantly would be how you own it, how you store it, where you store it. Switzerland would actually be a good location, and some of the drawbacks of it. I would then also look at cryptocurrencies, but I could get very, very deep into that. And I would also look at banks in Switzerland and supply chains, the future technology like drones, telecom. And in my 30 seconds, that's enough that I'm going to give to an audience, unless it's a member of FOA or a relationship that I have consulting with. But you got a little bit of some of the ideas I have. The problem is not the ideas. I could probably share them freely. It's going to take a lot of time and effort to execute on it. It's incredibly hard, even for families at billions, I didn't say billion, billions of dollars. It's incredibly hard. But back a little bit on track. So when I'm looking at banks and financial institutions and central banks, how has your research led you to the threat of nation states and cyber attack, the advent eventually, I think, one day of quantum computing? Oh, and by the way, they may not even need that to crack a lot of stuff. Why don't you look up something called factoring algorithms? Your opinion?
So your question is
cyber threats, especially by nation states. We probably know who they would be. I think it's a massive threat that is kind of swept underneath the rug.
I agree. Yeah.
And that is something that I also do some significant work on. And by the way, sometimes the solutions to some of the things I'm bringing up, there really isn't. It's just mitigating and managing some of the risk. But certain things you cannot stop from inevitably happening. We will have quantum. Hopefully, we'll have quantum defenses. And it is going to be a threat, including the things like the blockchain. But there may be solutions. I don't know. We'll see how that kind of plays out. But I'll argue, if a nation of power put their full efforts, including what I mentioned on factoring algorithms, they could cause a lot of damage. But let me not give them any ideas. Let's go a little bit into central bank digital currencies. In my opinion, I mean, come on. Digital is not going to go back to analog. The cat is out of the bag, spurred to some degree by Bitcoin and COVID and the fear that governments have of a loss of control. because they want things centralized, not decentralized. We're seeing it in China, like you said, a Scandinavian country. Off the top of my head, I think it's Sweden, but I might be wrong.
I think you're right,
and this is going to be, okay, maybe 5 or 10 years is a little too soon, but probably 10 or 15 years. And what does this mean? You're not going to have cash in hand. Everything is going to be through a wallet. They could control the interest rates. They will know
Do you really think 10 or 15 years? I think quicker.
I used to say 5 or 10, but I had so many people say that, but by the time it gets more worldwide adoption, it'll be 10 or 15 years. But you may be right. And that's actually a little scarier.
I think a smaller country could roll that out in a couple of years from now. You know, Sweden could do it. I don't think Switzerland could do it. I think Switzerland's really conservative, so we'll probably be one of the last to do it. But Iceland, for example, could roll that out if they chose. But what I can't, maybe, and you may know more about this than I fail to see how this doesn't break. So I think the force against it, and maybe you know more than, maybe you can explain this to me, but the force against it would be the existing commercial banking system, because suddenly I don't even need a bank account, right?
And these are all things that we're learning and that China's going through. Some will say that China, the country, has basically, you know what, to the banks, and is more in line with some of the fintech and financial intermediaries. Now, I can make the argument there's two ways to do central bank digital currencies. One is the government to have direct relationship with the public, and that is possible, probably more likely in a smaller country. And the other way is where the intermediaries, so it doesn't break the system, and maybe governments don't want to deal with the populace so directly, is to have the intermediary of a traditional institution via a wallet and how that is structured. So
then your local bank issues you the wallet, and then you carry that around.
Right. But if the bigger picture question is, are banks in some trouble? The short answer is kind of yes. And central bank digital currencies can play a part in that. I could argue it may kind of do away with savings and checking. I'll argue that there's other entities that are more effective from that perspective, and those are profitable entities for banks. And look at them being an intermediary through loans, and look at the rise of DeFi, decentralized finance. These are major threats to banking institutions. What I will say, and I'll stick here to the US, although I'm pretty fluid in Switzerland and around the world, Goldman, JP Morgan, Citibank, they're not going to sit idly by. They're going to be a part of this. They're part of the powers, quote unquote, the powers that be. They're going to have a say in it. They may say one thing, they're doing another. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan have been building out digital asset programs for years. They're very fluid in it. They know a hell of a lot about cryptocurrencies. They know a lot about the blockchain. And they're going to be a part of this kind of new world order and the system, I guess you could say, moving forward. Now, imagine how governments could take taxes out from you instantly. They know exactly what you're purchasing. This is really scary. There's no way to. So when I consult with those families again, I'm like, you can't stop this. I don't care if you're worth $200 million. You will not be able to stop this from occurring. It may take a little longer than what I'm saying, but you're going to have to put up with it. Now, you might have some things that would put you closer to the system, which goes into one of my points that I'll ask you. One of the recommendations that I sometimes make to some families, often at a truly significant level, billions and billions, is why don't you buy one of the existing banks in Switzerland? And they're like, why? Is it a good investment, Angelo? No, actually, it's probably from an investing perspective, not such a good investment. They're for sale often because they're not making money. They're antiquated. They need new people. They need new systems. There's lots of regulatory, but there is a buck coming up. It puts you close to the action of where the world's money flows through, which I still think Switzerland is the safest banking system in the world, but I'm open to your feedback. You scared me a little bit with Credit Suisse. And it puts you close to the central banker's central bank. That would be the Bank of International Settlements and the BIS. Why don't I let you run with all that? I gave you a lot to chew on.
Okay, I got a couple things for you. I mean, those banks are probably for sale because the Swiss banking model, I don't know how much your US listeners know about this.
Going down a bit.
The Swiss banking model has been smashed. It was the Americans who did it in 2008, forcing UBS to open up its, I think it was 2008, forcing UBS to cough up all the names of all the US citizens that was holding money for here in Switzerland, and they did. Those clients, a lot of them then ran across the street to Credit Suisse and on down the line of Swiss banks. But basically, the U.S. cracked open the bank secrecy in Switzerland and said, you got to with FATCA and stuff. You have to tell us who your U.S. clients are. So that's been going on. That was really, I was in the thick of that when I got here in 2012, 13. But then other countries came to Switzerland and Germany, France, and started demanding the same information about their own citizens. So the traditional banking model was just take money from anybody and do it discreetly and give them a numbered account or give them private and don't tell anybody who your clients are. And because they had the secrecy, these Swiss banks didn't really have to perform very well on the asset management side, because they were offering something that almost nobody else in the world could offer, which was the secrecy. So when they managed people's assets, they were not the best in the business. They often had high fees and poor performance and so on. With the breaking of the Swiss banking model, now you have banks that just can't compete because they never were very good at being asset managers. And now that they don't have secrecy to hide behind, the kind of the game is over for them. So I think that's the sort of structural change that's happened here in the last decade. Going back to your point about central bank digital currency, I was thinking, I'm going to think out loud a little bit if it's okay. I was wondering if in that world, if you have major countries with central bank digital currency being the only way to spend their currencies or to use their currencies, if you wouldn't end up with a sort of a competitive system where you have other countries who don't adopt this and who do a lot more cash business within their borders. Like say Switzerland decides never to do CBDC and it just keeps the Swiss franc, which people here love their cash, man. You can get 1,000, I don't have one with me now, but you can get 1,000 franc note. It's the biggest amount of money you can get in a banknote anywhere in the world, I believe. People love their cash. So what would it mean? I think we should think about this a little more maybe together, but what would it mean in a world where dollars and Chinese renminbi and yen, let's say, are all, and maybe euros are all central bank digital currencies, but then you have some smaller stable currencies, maybe British pounds, which decide not to go that route. Do they then become hotbeds for black market activity, or do they become... do they become desirable places to invest because of this and so on? I don't know. I think you would see that kind of a fragmented implementation. I don't see it being universal. So I think that'll
be interesting. It's a great question. I've thought about it. Could some of these countries effectively collude together? That could happen as well. But might Switzerland be the one that remains standing? Do they want some of what that may bring? Maybe that's debatable as well. But these are all great questions where, none of us have perfect answers for it because we don't know what the future is going to hold. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone potentially looking at 5, 10, 15 years. But I do think those are interesting questions that should be being asked. A couple of comments came in. One from a live participant brings up Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. What do you think?
That's true, right? That's pretty good.
Yes.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
I mean, that kind of works for me as well.
That's certainly what we saw in Iceland. I mean, those, just to bring it back to that, these banks were doing okay. They were just small, sleepy, government owned and serving their clients well. And then with this urge to grow came all the problems. And came the bad money to push that to push aside the legitimate business that they had been doing. Yes. What else?
Going back a little bit to my comment about Swiss banks for a certain subset of people, again, not necessarily from being a great investment. It's going to take money to buy it. It's going to take money to, I would say, recapitalize it. And you're probably fighting an uphill battle relative to decentralized finance, although governments are looking to fight back on that and have that more centralized. We may get to that relatively shortly. We'll see. And the before mentioned central bank digital currencies. But there is another reason, and I'll be more familiar with US citizens of great wealth, the money that you put in to buy a bank to capitalize it and some other sources of reserves is protected from, I'm going to have the wrong word, but basically the government going and reaching into that and taking it out on your behalf. They can't do that. I know what happened, and looking back, the industry in your community is like, it was UBS that kind of brought us down and we gave in to the US government. And I agree, they shouldn't have, but they did. That's water under the bridge. It's old news.
Well,
and there is value.
They didn't have much.
I said.
They didn't have much of a choice. I mean, the U.S. government said, if you want to clear U.S. dollars, you gotta hand this. I mean, they have the reserve currency. Closing UBS.
And if they didn't do that, do you think it would have brought down UBS?
Potentially, sure. Yeah, that's a huge deal. If you suddenly can't clear dollars in the U.S., I mean, you know, a big piece of UBS is on Wall Street, even, right? So, yeah, I think that would have been catastrophic for them.
That certainly might have been a big challenge. Yeah. We've mentioned Switzerland and central banks, and we've hinted at the central banker, the BIS. Tell us a little bit, for those that are not as familiar with the Bank of International Settlements.
They call themselves the central bank of the central banks. Mm-hmm. And many central banks and other participating banks have accounts with them. They do a lot of stuff behind the scenes to aid central banks, for example, in buying gold or selling gold, or swapping foreign currencies that they own for others. They're kind of, in a way, they have one role as plumbers for the central banks of the world. And the other thing they do is they do a lot of research on banking and central banking, and so they have pretty good research output as well. But in terms of what they do secretly in the plumbing, I'm fascinated by it.
Have you done some research, or was your research basically stifled? Like you're threatened to be kicked out of Switzerland.
I have to be careful what I say here. No, but I mean, it's when you live here, you end up meeting people who work there or worked there and so on, and you get to learn what they do. I mean, they're fairly open. They have podcasts and stuff about what they do. I think they may be playing a role in keeping some of the imbalances in the financial system that are there today. They certainly do the bidding of the most powerful central banks, and I think they can be a force for preserving the status quo, sometimes even when that's not helpful. But it's very, they're very secretive what they do, and for good reason. I mean, if a central bank wants to unload hundreds of millions or billions worth of gold or trade for a different type of asset, they don't want to do that openly, right? So
I'm looking at, and I don't know if my participant, he probably doesn't want his name mentioned, so I'm not going to mention the name. But
I see. Yeah, Ponzi scheme staging process. Ensure that all central banks don't collapse at once, so that the real problem does become obvious. Yeah, that's true. That's a cynical way, but yeah, there's some truth to that.
And for those that might have missed that, a live participant said the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, equals Ponzi scheme staging process to ensure that all central banks don't collapse at once, so that the real problems don't become obvious. Yeah, I thought your answer to that there was pretty good. Which brings us back a little bit into, I mean, there are major threats to banking. We mentioned central bank digital currencies. Now, again, they may end up being the middleman and being a part of it, but you have lots of regulatory pressures. You have increased capital demands. You have cyber threats. You have technology platforms that internally need to be updated. And then you do have competitors we didn't even get into yet. To some degree, companies like Square, like PayPal. I'll even argue Voyager, a Canadian company that many of you may know more as a crypto platform, but the opportunity of DeFi, of staking, of getting 3, 4, 5, 6%, way more than banks are paying. Banks have a sometimes I wonder how they do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think my general do you remember when Netscape came out in 1994?
Of course.
So I think where we are with crypto and some of these other new developments in fintech, we're kind of at the Netscape coming out point. And there's a lot more development ahead of us in this space, and none of us knows where that's going to go. I think we're just at the very beginning. And the reason I bring up Netscape is I was at MIT at the time, and we were already using another browser, I think, to look at. There was very few web pages then. It was in 94, 93. But a lot of people in the public mistook Netscape for something super valuable because it was the browser. But that was just a tool to view. The real value to me was the data that you could suddenly view on the web, right? You could suddenly have access to information that you didn't have before. That's the really valuable thing. But people got hung up on Netscape, which was just the shell, was just the wrapper. And they thought Netscape was going to be, worth zillions of dollars. When it went public, it did very well. But Bill Gates just could kill that thing with a flip of a switch. He just created Internet Explorer and gave that to everyone for free. And then people could see I think people began to see how Netscape, how the browser wasn't really the value. And I kind of think that's where we are with, for example, crypto. There is some value there, but we're just at that level. We don't know where this is going to develop. You may disagree with me.
To some degree, I do, but I want to hear all points of views. And okay, let's kind of jump somewhat into that. Is Bitcoin a threat to traditional banking? And part two, is it a threat to the US dollar?
I have to say, I don't see how it is. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an anecdote. When they do these ransomware schemes, where didn't they do something where they shut down a
Colonial Pipeline in the US?
Yeah, Colonial Pipeline, that's right. And so then they ask for Bitcoin payment to pay the ransom. But they never ask for Bitcoin. They never say, send us 2 Bitcoins. They say, send us $10,000 in Bitcoin.
Well, we could dive a little bit into that one. What scares some people who are maybe hardcore advocates in the community is, boy, the U.S. government got to the bottom of that one really, really quick.
But forget that particular case. I've seen a few of these these ransomware cases where they ask for another currency paid out in Bitcoin. It's like, if Bitcoin were really a currency, you just ask for the currency. You don't ask for 10,000 euros paid in dollars. You just ask for 10,000 euros. So
now, given your engineering background at MIT, you probably first heard about Satoshi's white paper come October of 2008. Probably like me, I'm in my mid 50s now. So I was in my early 40s then, kind of didn't really pay it too much attention. I heard the Winklevi twins in my backyard of Greenwich, Connecticut talk about it. Might have been 2011 or 12. And again, I just wasn't ready for it. I heard other speakers. I became more familiar with it. What I said earlier about MIT, let me think for myself. Let me do research. Let me do my own thought leadership. Let me purchase some so I feel engaged by it and I can understand the process. And then that took me further down the road of broadly more than Bitcoin and Ethereum, but the crypto and DeFi and even now NFTs. And now it's been 12, 13 years in. the industry is growing. We have a public company like Coinbase in the US. We have US senators like Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming that are advocates and owners of Bitcoin. We have pretty strong advocacy groups and special interest groups. We have tens of thousands of people employed by the community. I don't see it going away. I thought the direction that you might have been headed was with the Netscape. Is that Bitcoin or is that Yahoo? And is a Google going to come up that's going to crush them that we don't know yet?
Yes, that could be one of the things that happens. I just mean that there is something there of value. I can't quite see it, but I think that there is. And I think that the further developments in the next 10, 20 years we will then see it clearly.
Okay, but some important questions there. One, yes, the tremendous first mover and network effect that Bitcoin has. And I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist. Those are people that basically think it's Bitcoin or nothing else. I'm definitely not a fan of that. But I have respect for the first mover, its network effect. It's a brand name that many people around the world know.
Yep.
But yeah, there still is complexities, understanding it, how to purchase it, how to safely secure it. In the US, we don't have something super simple like an ETF yet. That will likely inevitably occur. And here's what I will say positively about Bitcoin, at least as far as I know. It has been truly, I guess you could say, decentralized, where now we're starting to see the government become more familiar with it. They're putting their noses into regulatory issues, and there's been mutual compromises. We didn't get too deeply into DeFi and staking, and is that a security, and is the SEC going to get involved in that here in the US? And they probably will to some extent. In other words, maybe what are you also hearing in Switzerland and around the world relative to government concern and things they could do, mainly around regulation and arguably taxation to stifle it?
Well, so Switzerland is a special case because we have Crypto Alley here.
Yes, you do.
Just over the hill from where I'm sitting. And FINMA came out, which is the Swiss regulator, with some really supportive policies to encourage innovation in this space. And it's Crypto Alley. I think it's slowed down a little bit now, but they were rolling out like hundreds of cryptocurrencies, a year or something over there. But actually doing some really interesting work around tokenization of assets, putting real estate, having a token that would stand for a series of properties, for example.
Right, or real estate, etc.
Yeah. And so I think here has been quite positive. I think getting back to your points about Bitcoin, I think it's a pretty good store of value, right? But actually, I'm not 100% sold on that. Okay, I don't know. The three things a currency is supposed to do, right? It's a store of value, a medium of exchange, and unit of account. So store of value, I can kind of see for Bitcoin. The other two, medium of exchange, in my example from the ransomware, people aren't using it. Well, and unit of account, they're not using it. They're not saying my business is worth 3 Bitcoins.
That may be terminology that we start to use moving forward.
That would be cool if people,
as the cyberpunks, as the Generation Z come to fruition.
Yeah.
That this may be part of their lingo, their verbiage, what they're comfortable with. I mean, have you noticed that in your research with the younger generation, very distrusting of government, of big institutions, of banks, and really liking the decentralized nature, as far as we know it now, of Bitcoin and certain cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, and it may be biased because in Zurich people are pretty excited about them, but I think there's a lot of interest here for cryptocurrencies in general.
Yes, I think I'm glad you brought that up. I was familiar with that when I do my visit to Switzerland next year. Of course, I do want to for sure visit Crypto Valley, and I have lots of meetings and things all planned out. Hopefully that will, nothing will happen with another variant or something like Delta. So we'll see how that plays out. But Switzerland has been on the cutting edge more than people would think or give it credit for relative to this aspect of the community. They do see that things are changing. They don't want to be left behind. And I do think they're actually going to be a leader in some of the things that you bring up. Well, we kind of covered it, but I'm going to read a comment by someone. The advent of digital currencies may allow people and businesses to get around banks. Who said that? Thomas Hoenig, a former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas. He continues, if cryptos become a substitute for the dollar, they could create a separate monetary environment that would make monetary policies more difficult to implement. Mm-hmm. I am not denying that he's correct. And those are some of the things that would scare the government. Now, could the US government, with our Constitution and free speech, completely ban, let's say, Bitcoin? One, you never know. Don't underestimate the power and the violence and the capabilities of a government. That's one thing I would say. But on the surface, here in the US, given that it could be also printed code, etc., it's all open, the theoretical answer is no. But to think that they can have massive influence, if you're what I would call a Bitcoin maximalist, you're completely foolish. They could. Suppose they, cancel out Coinbase, public company, and just, delist it. Right. That could be terrible. There's other things they could do. Okay, it's property. We're going to treat it like real estate and charge an annual tax on it. Mm-hmm. And, maybe we go from 1 or 2% to 5 or 10%. That would be now what the other side will argue is, okay, go ahead and do that. You can't, the genie's out of the bottle. We do see how great being decentralized is in the peer-to-peer community and the power of that. I will leave this country and I'll go to a country that's going to be more open to it. Let's randomly say Canada. So yes, that could potentially be a counter argument. Here's where it gets sticky. If powerful countries, whatever, the US, Switzerland, UK, etc., kind of band together and have a little bit of a coordinated effort, that could be a big problem. There also is another problem, less to do with government, although arguably they could kind of do this too. They pop down electrical grids, we have a problem. I mean, there's always risk and things that could go wrong.
Is there any jurisdiction in the US that will accept tax payments in Bitcoin? Because here there's a couple.
I don't think there is. I mean, we all know the stories about how certain, actually someone who does know responded with the answer yes. Yeah. And that would be someone who would know, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, here there's a couple.
Okay, that actually was, I guess, a bit of a pleasant surprise. There were some questions, but I think we already asked them. How about DeFi being a threat to traditional banking? That is for sure a no-brainer. That decentralized finance is a threat, but we'll see. And we're seeing some of it now with the SEC, the US government. Are they going to regulate it? Are they basically making what is decentralized debatable to some degree and looking to make it very centralized so they have control? And again, like I said earlier about the power of governments, there may to some degree be nothing even you as a multi-billionaire could do about it. You kind of have to work with what you're able to work with and what you got. Now, what are you hearing in Switzerland relative to crypto and digital assets with things like stable coins and broadly the blockchain and NFTs? Is there anything specific you wanted to comment on?
No, I don't. My perception, and this may be incorrect, but my perception is that a lot of that activity has tapered a bit in crypto. Is that your perception in crypto, Ali? There was a big boom like 3 years ago, I feel like, and now it's there was a lot of startups. There was a lot of people talking on LinkedIn. There was a lot of meetups and things. I feel like things have stabilized a bit. Maybe some of the chaff has blown away, and we're left with fewer, stronger players here.
I'm not as familiar with Crypto Valley where you are. I would say here in the US, in my feedback that I get and number of views on certain videos and people that I interact with in the community, it's
Yep.
booming,
Okay.
for lack of a better word, which again is why I don't see the US government coming too hardcore on it, but they may want to tax it and have more controls than they do now. Of course, they want to tax it so they could benefit from it. Why just try to cancel something out and fight a battle you may not be able to win? I might as well accept it, try to have some controls and tax it. Now, of course, I don't like that, but that's just inevitable about over, in time, I could argue what could happen.
Yeah.
How about, look at all the intermediaries, like middlemen, like Western Union and MoneyGram. Don't you think with what we're talking about now, including central bank digital currencies and fintech and the increasing influence of technology companies in finance, I would say anything that's a middle person is going to be threatened by many of the things we're talking about now: decentralization, DeFi, crypto,
Yep.
Bitcoin broadly, and definitely central bank digital currencies. The utilization of wallets and moving forward with them, those are all businesses that will be threatened.
I totally agree, especially on the wallets. Yeah, if it's easy for me to move money to you, now actually it's pretty easy here. I can put money in any account in the world, I think, except for the US. But yeah, I could just go in my online banking and create a Swift wire and put money anywhere I want in the world. It doesn't. I don't think it even costs me anything. So that's nice, but it would be even nicer if I could do that, wallet to wallet on a phone.
Yeah, that's pretty much how they're doing it in China. It's pretty amazing in terms of, you go there and how technology proficient a lot of that is, which actually does bring up my next question. Here in the US, we have some all powerful companies in technology: Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. They dabble to some degree, as much as they're allowed by US regulators, quasi into fintech and financial services. Apple Card and Google have new checking accounts as the first steps towards big tech into retail financial services. Do you think that's inevitable here in the US and maybe more broadly globally? And is that good or bad?
I guess it is inevitable, right? These companies need to grow somewhere next. And I think especially the US financial landscape is so fragmented. It would be kind of ripe for them to go in and but I don't know how successful they would be in other places. I don't know if they're like, did you see that I was reading up today for this interview? I was reading up on the Facebook digital currency Libra, which they changed their name to DM.
Right.
And they applied with the Swiss FINMA for a license here, and they withdrew their application a couple of months ago, 5 months ago. So I don't know the backstory of that, but that's kind of gone quiet. Back to your question, I think especially in the US, those companies will probably be successful rolling out some kind of banking alternatives.
Right. They look at what's happening with their counterpart companies in China and see how incredibly valuable and successful that has been. And you're correct. They're going to want to say, hey, we could do this better than banks. I would say broadly a challenge that I have with banks is they're almost like too big to fail. They're very protected by the government. There's tremendous amounts of regulation. Like you said, there's a level of cronyism and other challenges in banking where they're not edgy. They're not on the edge of their seats with technology, with cyber threats. And I look at companies like some of the ones I mentioned as being way more advanced logistically and with capability. Now, do I like some of the big data and some of the things they're going to get from me? No, but that may inevitably be a trade-off that's going to happen. Banking as we know it is going to be rocked and be very different in the coming years. I don't think you could deny that.
That's right. Yeah, I think on WeChat, right, on the Chinese chat app, you can send money.
Oh, yes, of course.
Right? So, yeah, that should be happening. That should be available. and everywhere. You should be able to send a few bucks, to the person you just had lunch with to pay for the lunch or whatever. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the next frontier for for Apple, for example, or Google.
And I think the Zuckerberg's Facebook Diem that used to be, like you said, the Libra was a very intriguing project. It scared the hell out of governments, including the US government. It may come back in some form. And again, I would have some level of concerns here or there, but I find it interesting. And these are all things that governments are going to be very protective. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. It's been that for about 70 years now.
Yep.
I could look back in history and say that might be about it if you go by what we've seen in the past. I would say the immediate near future, I don't know, 2 to 10 years, I likely don't see that changing. But looking a little further out, China, Bitcoin, I mean, do you see the franc even? Do you see threats to the US dollar's dominance?
Yeah, especially if this vote doesn't go this week, right? You have this debt ceiling thing.
Yep.
No, definitely. I think China would like to slowly move its way into that space. They're very careful. Even when Chinese officials give interviews, they say things like, "We're not looking." Actually, in one of their central bank digital currency pieces recently, they said, "Oh, we're not looking to displace the dollar here as the world's reserve currency. We're just working." They're very careful. They're very delicate about this, but I think they're slowly moving things in that direction. And I think that's kind of inevitable that we'll be living in China's world sooner or later. So yeah, I see that as just kind of the natural unfolding of things today.
I would say that China looks at things very, very, very long term. They may not get what they want for, as you described, for 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 years.
Yeah, that's fine with them.
50, 100 years out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But, sometimes those best laid plans, nothing goes as you plan. So I would say that might be correct. That probably is statistically what may even be the most likely to occur looking 30 plus years out. But who knows? There's so much that could evolve. What I would be, as an American, I would have some concerns that we're not moving fast enough on some of the things I spoke about. You could argue, let's see China do it and learn from them. I don't know. Sometimes, you gave an example of a first mover that didn't work out, and so did I with the Yahoo. But sometimes it is a tremendous advantage.
Yep.
I mean, they're rebuilding infrastructure and systems that haven't been done before. They're building it from scratch, which is taking a lot of time and effort. And we've seen, and trust me, there's tremendous challenges with China. We've seen some of that develop in their real estate and their public markets, just terrible, like no transparency.
Yep.
But nonetheless, when you look at it long term, definitely as an American, I would have some concern.
What do you think about What do you think? Are you following Evergrande right now?
Yeah, I am not following it as much as I probably should, but I'm not surprised by it.
No, me neither. Do you think this is China's Lehman?
Yes, I think it could be. And again, I praised China to some degree for its advancements in AI, in quantum, in fintech, what they're doing in central bank digital currencies, although I don't like it per se for me. I know it's inevitable. Maybe they're doing a good thing, doing the first step. But there's elements of lack of transparency, of course, being a communist country, and other areas where I think their economy could be gravely challenged as well. But I do think they're looking at it in blocks of multiple decades and decades. I actually have someone who may be on the live now that says, Angelo, forget decades. How about blocks of hundreds of years? Yeah. And I do think they have that perspective.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked to comment more about the Diem. I'm going to keep that a little close to the vest for now. I'm intrigued by it. Why don't I leave it at that? There is something, there are crypto-centric banks and unique things happening here in the US that, again, the government's behind. They're happening often in Wyoming. There's things like the American Crypto Fed, DAOs, the Ducat, I believe it's pronounced. These are all going to be newer terminologies and things to a lot of people. I would say look them up. The DUCET, the American Crypto Fed, and DAOs are known as DAOs, and they're very, very intriguing. And notice how that will also have a hand in government interaction and all of that good stuff. I might have a couple of more chat feature questions that came in.
I just responded to someone on there who said, how about Evergrande being Bear Stearns and Lehman and AIG out there as unknowns? And I said it's an even better analogy.
That's a good one.
I think that's a really good one. Yeah.
There was also one before that said, what about a basket of digital currencies becoming a reserve similar to SDRs?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that would be interesting.
How about a basket of mixed traditional and digital currencies?
Oh, for sure. I mean, these are all things that I could see evolving. And again, I try to put aside my hat as being an American. Is that the best for the dollar? It's probably not. But inevitably, again, these are trends that I'm seeing that you're not just going to make go away. Maybe you delay it a little bit, but these are things that I think are happening. And in the work that I do with families, again, sometimes no matter who you are, you can't change the inevitable. Why don't you pre-plan for it, plan if it happens, and effectively have an A, B, and C. And those are some of the things I deal with on the sovereign risk issues that I mentioned earlier. Jared, this has been a very wide-ranging conversation. I really enjoyed it. I'd like for you to maybe give a recap about the book that you wrote and how people could purchase it come its availability on, I believe that's October 4th. There it is.
Yeah, there it is. Iceland's Secret. It's out in 1 week from today, the 5th, actually, Tuesday. You can order it now on Amazon. I did the Audible, so if you like my voice, you can listen to me for 10 hours reading you the bedtime story of the book. And it's also available as an ebook, of course. And it's really the inside story of, I think it's the world's biggest con. It's the world's biggest stock market manipulation cases, how they were investigated and how they kind of took down and transformed a small country. So I think it's very relevant today. I kind of feel like we're heading back into those type of dangerous times in the markets. So I think it's a perfect read for today. People tell me they're reading it in like 1 day because they're getting hooked into it. It's a page
absolutely
turner. So so yeah, enjoy it, and thanks, Angelo, for the time and for a good conversation.
I highly recommend the book. It was really engaging to have a conversation with you today. Are there other ways on social media that my audience could follow you? Are there blogs that you write? How could they engage even deeper?
I have started Twitter again. I had put it away for a while because I was taking too much time, but I'm back on Twitter. So Jared Bibler on Twitter. And also on LinkedIn, I'm often putting up interesting things there. So those are my two main outlets right now.
Excellent. Jared, it's been tremendous to have a chance to interview you. I look forward to rereading the book from the galley, I guess, or so that I got, and really, watching and learning from you in the future and having you back on. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles, founder and CEO at Family Office Association and host of the Angelo Robles podcast. I'm very active on social media. You'll find me on Instagram, on LinkedIn, both a business and a personal page. YouTube, we're very active on. Simply, we're Family Office, so we're very easy to find. And I maintain an active podcast on Apple and Spotify as well. Learn more about Family Office Association, including membership and the consulting work that I do, by simply going to familyofficeassociation.com. Everyone, thank you to our live audience, especially thank you to Jared, and those of you that watch or listen in the future. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.